For most of our history, the simple act of falling asleep was an act of survival. We forget this now. We close our eyes in rooms held at a constant 20 degrees, wrapped in synthetic fabrics engineered to trap body heat, on mattresses designed by sleep scientists. We set our alarms and we drift off as though the night owes us nothing. But for the vast majority of humans who ever lived, the night was not a guarantee. It was a negotiation between the body and the cold, between exhaustion and the very real possibility that you might not wake up at all. In medieval Europe, roughly from the 5th century to the 15th, winter was not merely uncomfortable, it was lethal. Temperatures across northern and central Europe could plunge well below freezing for months at a stretch. And in the centuries leading into what climatologists now call the Little Ice Age, those winters grew steadily more punishing. There was no central heating. There was no insulation as we understand it. There were no thermostats, no double-glazed windows, no electric blankets. And yet, hundreds of millions of people slept through those winters, generation after generation, for 1,000 years. They did not merely endure the cold, they built an entire architecture of survival around it. One so sophisticated, so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, that most of it has been completely forgotten. To understand how medieval people slept without freezing, we must first understand the homes they slept in. And by modern standards, those homes were barely homes at all. The typical medieval peasant dwelling was a single-room structure, built from whatever the land provided. In England, that usually meant a timber frame packed with wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered over with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. In Scandinavia, walls were made from turf or stacked logs. In parts of France and the Low Countries, rough stone with mud pointing served as the outer shell. None of these materials offered what we would recognize as insulation. The walls were thin. The wind found every gap. Moisture crept through the stones and the thatch. And the floors were nothing but packed earth. Cold, damp earth that radiated chill upward into the room like a slow, patient enemy. Windows, where they existed at all, were small openings covered with wooden shutters or oiled linen. Glass was a cathedral luxury until well into the 13th century, and even then, only the wealthiest households could afford it. The result was a permanent choice. Open the shutter and admit both light and freezing air, or close it and sit in darkness. Most chose darkness. In winter, when all shutters were sealed, the interior of a peasant cottage was a dim, smoky chamber where condensation dripped from the underside of the thatched roof, and small birds and insects nested overhead, scattering debris onto the sleepers below. The wind moaned through every crack in the walls. This was the bedroom, but within these fragile structures, the medieval household possessed one weapon against the cold that was more important than any wall or roof: the hearth. Fire was not a convenience in the medieval home. It was the axis around which all life turned. In peasant dwellings, and the hearth was typically an open fire pit set directly in the center of the single room with no chimney, just a hole in the roof or a gap in the thatch through which smoke was meant to escape. The word "meant" is doing considerable work in that sentence. In practice, the room filled with smoke. Chronic respiratory illness was one of the defining afflictions of medieval life, and the open hearth was its primary engine. Yet the fire could not be allowed to die, especially at night. The last task before sleep was banking the fire, carefully covering the embers with ash to slow their burn without extinguishing them. A well-banked fire could smolder for 8 to 10 hours, releasing a low, steady warmth that kept the room just barely above freezing. The faint orange glow of those embers was often the only light in the house after dark. And when the fire did go out on a particularly cold night, the consequences could be severe. Restarting it from scratch, with flint, steel, and tinder, was a slow and unreliable process in the dark. Some households kept a clay pot of hot coals buried in ash as a backup. Others simply prayed that the embers held. Chimneys, which we take so completely for granted that we barely think of them as technology, were a genuine revolution. The earliest written records of domestic chimneys appear in Italy, and the innovation slowly spread northward through the 12th and 13th centuries. But for most of the medieval period, and for most of the population, the chimney was a luxury as remote as glass windows. The fire sat in the center of the room, and the smoke went where it pleased. Now, once the fire was banked and the shutters sealed, the medieval household turned to the second great system of warmth, the bed itself. And the medieval bed was an engineered response to the cold in ways that our modern mattresses are not. For the poorest, which was most people, sleeping meant lying on a pallet of straw or dried peat spread over the stone or earth floor, as close to the hearth as possible. The straw was changed once a year if the household was diligent, and it was shared with fleas, lice, and bedbugs in numbers that would horrify a modern sleeper. But the straw served a purpose beyond padding. It was insulation. A thick layer of dried organic material between the body and the frozen ground could mean the difference between discomfort and hypothermia. For those with slightly more means, a successful tradesman, a prosperous farmer, the bed was the single most valuable piece of furniture in the house. Not the table, not the chair, the bed. It was so important that it was routinely mentioned in wills and passed down through generations as an heirloom. A well-appointed medieval bed consisted of a wooden frame strung with tightly knotted ropes, the origin of the expression "sleep tight," supporting a layered system of mattresses. First, a base mattress stuffed with straw. Over that, if affordable, a second layer filled with wool, and for the truly fortunate, a top layer filled with feathers or down, imported from France since the English had not yet mastered the art of dressing and preserving feathers for bedding. The entire assembly could be built so high that wooden steps were required to climb into it. But the most critical feature of the medieval bed was not the mattress, it was the canopy. Beginning in the 12th and 13th centuries, wealthier households suspended fabric from the ceiling above the bed, creating a closed enclosure around the sleeper. By the 14th century, this evolved into the four-poster bed, tall wooden columns supporting a solid tester overhead, with heavy curtains on all sides that could be drawn shut. The curtains were not decorative, they were functional. When closed, they created a sealed pocket of air around the sleeper, trapping body heat and blocking the drafts that moved constantly through even the best-built rooms. The temperature inside a curtained bed, with 2 or 3 bodies generating warmth, could be 15 to 20 degrees higher than the room outside. The canopy bed was not a luxury, and it was a survival technology disguised as furniture. For those who could afford neither frame nor canopy, warmth came from a simpler and more ancient technology: other human bodies. Communal sleeping was not a quirk of medieval life. It was the default. Entire families slept together in a single bed or on a shared pallet. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, sometimes servants. The arrangement was not random. In many households, a specific sleeping order was maintained: the eldest daughter against the wall, then the younger children in sequence, then the mother, the father, and any sons on the outer edge, with guests placed at the far end. Every body was a heat source. Every gap between bodies was a vulnerability. At inns, travelers were expected to share beds with strangers. The protocol was rigid. Each sleeper occupied their own half. Fidgeting was forbidden. Physical contact was to be minimized. In the cheapest establishments, the arrangement was even more austere: a wooden bench with a horizontal rope strung at chest height. Travelers would sit side by side and drape their arms over the rope for support, sleeping upright through the night. In the morning, the bench was cleared and washed down. This was a bed. Before retiring, households employed every technique available to pre-warm the sleeping space: a copper or brass warming pan, a long-handled dish filled with glowing coals from the hearth, was passed between the sheets to drive out the worst of the cold. Heated stones or bricks, wrapped in cloth, were placed at the foot of the bed. And then, once the body was finally horizontal, the final layer of defense was clothing. Medieval people did not sleep naked. They slept in layers: a linen undergarment worn against the skin. Over that, a woolen shift or gown, thick woolen stockings or hose, and, critically, a nightcap, a tightly fitted cap that covered the head and ears. The nightcap was not an affectation of fashion. It was a calculated response to a thermodynamic reality. The human head, which must remain uncovered by blankets for breathing, radiates a disproportionate amount of body heat. In a room hovering near freezing, an uncovered head could lose enough warmth to make sleep impossible. The nightcap was as essential as the blanket. Wool, above all other materials, was the fabric of medieval survival. Unlike linen, which wicks moisture and cools the skin, wool retains warmth even when wet. In a world where condensation dripped from ceilings and damp was a permanent condition of life, this property was not a minor advantage. It was the reason wool dominated European textile production for the entirety of the Middle Ages. The woolen blanket was not a comfort, it was infrastructure. But in many parts of Europe, the most effective heating system in a medieval home was not the hearth, not the bed, and not the clothing. It was the cow. Across Scandinavia, northern Germany, the Low Countries, Brittany, and parts of Britain, the standard dwelling for much of the medieval period was the longhouse, a single elongated structure, typically 15 to 30 meters in length, divided internally into two zones. Humans occupied one end, livestock occupied the other. A cross passage or low partition separated them, but no wall sealed them apart. The animals, cattle, sheep, goats, sometimes pigs, generated a constant low-grade warmth simply by existing. A single adult cow produces roughly the same heat output as a small space heater. Place 10 or 15 cattle at one end of an enclosed structure, and the thermal contribution is significant. The body heat of the animals radiated through the shared interior, raising the ambient temperature of the entire house by several degrees. Enough in many cases to keep the human occupants alive on nights when the fire alone would not have sufficed. This arrangement offended later sensibilities. 18th century commentators viewed it as barbaric, as evidence of peasant ignorance. But it was nothing of the sort. It was a rational, efficient, and deeply practical response to the thermodynamic realities of a world without fossil fuels. The longhouse was a heat exchange system. The humans fed and sheltered the animals. The animals, in return, warmed the humans. The smell was considerable. The hygiene was questionable by any standard. But the system worked. For 1,000 years, it worked. And then there was the matter of sleep itself. Not merely where medieval people slept, but how they slept. Because the structure of sleep in the Middle Ages was fundamentally different from anything we practice today. In 2001, the historian A. Roger E. Kirch published a discovery that reshaped our understanding of pre-industrial sleep. While researching nocturnal life in early modern Europe, he came across a reference in a 17th century legal deposition to a girl who had woken from her first sleep. The phrase was unremarkable in context, mentioned casually as though it needed no explanation. But to E. Kirch, it implied the existence of a second sleep, which implied a period of wakefulness in between. He began searching. He found over 2,000 references in more than a dozen languages stretching back to Homer's Odyssey. The evidence was overwhelming. For most of human history, people did not sleep in a single consolidated block. They slept in two phases. The pattern was roughly this. A household would retire shortly after dark, typically between 8 and 9 in the evening. They would fall into what was called the first sleep, a deep restorative phase lasting roughly 4 hours. Around midnight or 1 in the morning, they would wake naturally. This was not insomnia, it was expected. The period between the two sleeps, sometimes called the watch, lasted 1 to 2 hours. People used it for a remarkable variety of purposes: prayer, quiet conversation, tending the fire, checking on livestock, visiting neighbors, reflecting on their dreams. 16th century French physicians recommended this interval as the optimal time for conception, arguing that both partners would be more relaxed after their first rest. Monks rose for the night office of matins, believing their prayers during the dark hours protected the surrounding parish from demonic influence. Some simply lay in the faint glow of the banked fire and thought. Then, around 2 or 3 in the morning, they returned to their second sleep, a lighter phase that lasted until dawn. The entire cycle consumed 10 to 12 hours of darkness in winter, which meant that medieval sleep, far from being shorter than ours, was significantly longer. The two-phase pattern was not a cultural choice. It appears to have been a biological default. When modern researchers place subjects in environments without artificial light for extended periods, the participants spontaneously reverted to biphasic sleep within weeks. First sleep, a wakeful interval, second sleep, precisely matching the pattern E. Kirch found in the historical record. This ancient rhythm vanished with astonishing speed. As gaslighting and then electricity colonized the night in the 19th century, the dark hours shrank. People stayed awake later. The interval between sleeps compressed and eventually disappeared. By the early 20th century, the 8-hour consolidated block had become the new normal, and the very memory of the old pattern had been erased. Today, Millions of people who wake in the middle of the night and cannot immediately fall back asleep are diagnosed with sleep maintenance insomnia, a disorder that may in fact be nothing more than the echo of a rhythm our species followed for millennia. What emerges from all of this is not a story of deprivation. It is a story of adaptation. Medieval people did not survive the cold by accident. They survived it through a dense, interlocking system of solutions. Architectural, textile, social, biological, each component reinforcing the others. The hearth warmed the room. The banked embers sustained the warmth through the night. The canopied bed trapped body heat. The communal sleepers multiplied it. The wool retained it. The livestock supplemented it. And the biphasic sleep pattern ensured that someone was always awake to tend the fire, check the animals, and maintain the fragile equilibrium between warmth and death. None of these systems were elegant by modern standards. The rooms were smoky, the beds were infested, the air was thick with the smell of animals and unwashed bodies. But elegance was never the point. The point was waking up in the morning, and for 1,000 years, across a continent without electricity, without central heating, without any of the invisible infrastructure we depend on every night of our lives, that system delivered. We sleep now in climate-controlled silence, in each of us alone in our separate rooms, sealed away from the cold and from each other. We have solved